The story begins on a quiet afternoon in a small American town, where two travelers' close friends sit together in the dim light of a library that smelled of old paper, wood polish, and dust. They were not looking for anything in particular, just flipping through shelves, as if trying to pass the time. But sometimes the most unusual journeys begin when no one expects them. One of them, restless as always, tugged a massive, leather-bound book from the far corner of the shelf. The cover was cracked, edges frayed, and the golden letters had faded so badly that they looked like strange scratches. When the book landed on the table, it gave off a faint smell of burnt wood, almost as though it had been rescued from fire centuries ago. They opened it carefully. Inside were maps unlike anything seen before, landscapes drawn in ancient ink, rivers winding into places unmarked by modern names, mountains towering over empty plains, and strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly when touched. The words were written in a language half recognizable, a mixture of Latin, Old English, and something older still. As they traced the symbols, something unexpected happened. The pages began to vibrate, as though humming with invisible energy. The sound was subtle at first, like wind trapped inside a bottle, then stronger, until the entire library seemed to shudder. They looked at each other in disbelief, unable to move. The book glowed, and the air thickened, making it hard to breathe. They felt their skin prickle, their ears pop as though they had entered an airplane cabin. Then, without warning, the room dissolved into darkness. Shelves disappeared, the table vanished beneath their hands, and the smell of dust was replaced with wet soil, pine needles, and the sharp chill of mountain air. When they opened their eyes fully, they were no longer in the library. They stood on a rocky path surrounded by tall cliffs, the sky above painted with the fiery orange of a setting sun. In the distance, a vast valley stretched out, with a river, glittering like liquid glass, and forests so thick they seemed endless. The sound of birds echoed through the air, birds that did not sound like anything from modern America. It took them a moment to realize what had happened. The book was gone. Their clothes, however, were no longer modern. Instead, they were heavy, cloaks of wool and leather boots that were stiff but sturdy. A pouch hung at their sides filled with dried herbs, a knife, and coins that looked hammered by hand. Their breaths came fast, not just from fear, but from the shock of standing somewhere impossible. The rocky path beneath them felt solid, real. The cold wind cut through their cloaks. Far off, smoke rose from what looked like a settlement, small fires glowing in the distance. They began walking, unsure of where to go, but knowing standing still meant freezing. The path was narrow and uneven, and every stone seemed ready to trip them. On one side, the cliffs dropped sharply into shadow. On the other, jagged rocks climbed toward the sky. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind whistling through cracks in the stone. As they moved forward, they noticed strange carvings, etched into the cliff wall, spirals, circles, and figures resembling men with spears and strange animals with elongated heads. The carvings looked fresh, as though made only days ago, though everything around suggested they belonged to another time. Soon, they reached a wider section of the path, where an ancient wooden bridge stretched across a deep gorge. The ropes looked frayed, the planks uneven and damp. The gorge below was filled with rushing water, foaming white as it crashed against boulders. Crossing it felt like stepping into certain death. Yet, it was the only way forward. The first step onto the bridge made the wood groan. The ropes creaked like bones under strain. Each step was measured, careful, as the wind blew stronger, tugging at their cloaks. Halfway across, the bridge swayed so violently that one nearly lost their balance. Gripping the rope tightly with trembling hands, the drop below seemed endless, the roar of the river deafening. But they made it to the other side, breathless, hearts pounding. The land ahead was different, softer, with patches of green grass, clusters of wildflowers, and the faint sound of drums. Following the sound, they found a trail of footprints pressed into the earth, leading toward the smoke they had seen earlier. At the edge of the forest, they caught their first glimpse of people. A group of travelers passed by, dressed in furs and carrying wooden staffs. Their faces were sharp, their expressions cautious. The strangers spoke in a language unfamiliar, but melodic, filled with deep tones and rolling consonants. They paused when they saw the two newcomers, eyes narrowing with suspicion. One of the men stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair tied with leather bands. He studied them in silence, then pointed to the pouches at their sides. Without saying a word, he motioned for them to follow. Refusing might have meant hostility, so they nodded and walked behind him. The path led into a settlement nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. Wooden huts smoked from their chimneys, and fires burned in the center where people gathered, cooking meat over spits. Children ran barefoot, laughing, while older men sharpened weapons or tended to horses. The smell of roasted meat mixed with pine smoke filled the air. The villagers looked at the newcomers curiously, whispering among themselves. Some reached out to touch their cloaks, feeling the material as if it were unfamiliar. The tall man led them to the largest hut at the edge of the settlement. Inside, the walls were decorated with animal hides, bones carved into shapes, and symbols painted in red ochre. At the center sat an elder, her hair white as snow, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She spoke slowly, her voice low but commanding, though the language was strange. They understood parts of it, as though the meaning carried itself beyond words. She told them they had crossed into a time long before their own, into an age where stories were carved into stone and journeys were measured not in miles, but in lifetimes. She warned them that the valley was cursed by something ancient, something that had lived there long before the first people came. The villagers believed the newcomer's arrival was no accident. The elder claimed the mountain spirits had opened the path for them, and that their journey would test not only their courage, but their very place in the world. The firelight flickered against her face as she leaned forward, whispering words that chilled them more than the mountain air. Once you begin this path, you cannot turn back. The valley remembers. The valley does not forgive. They exchanged a look, fear mixing with a strange excitement. Something deep inside told them the journey had only just begun, and whatever lay ahead would change them forever. The night in the valley carried a weight that neither of them had ever felt before. The fire in the center of the settlement crackled and spat, sparks shooting into the air, dissolving into the dark sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. They sat together near the flames, trying to calm their breathing, the elder's words still echoing in their minds. The valley remembers. The valley does not forgive dot around them. The villagers carried on as though nothing unusual had been said. Children slept wrapped in furs. Hunters sharpened their spears with stone tools. Women stirred thick pots of stew that smelled of venison and herbs. Neither of the travelers could identify the sound of flutes made from bone played somewhere in the distance, weaving a haunting tune that seemed to carry secrets of the mountains themselves. Every glance they received from the villagers was heavy, not hateful, not exactly welcoming either, more like watching a storm roll in, uncertain of what it might bring. The tall man who had led them into the village sat across the fire, his eyes fixed on them with unblinking intensity, as though waiting for them to reveal who they truly were. One of them leaned closer to the other, whispering, "We're not supposed to be here. None of this makes sense." The other replied quietly, "It doesn't matter if it makes sense. We're here now, and I don't think we'll get back until we find out why." The elder rose slowly from her place, leaning on a staff decorated with feathers, carved bones, and small stones tied with leather. The entire settlement fell silent. She began to chant, her voice deep and rhythmic, rising and falling like the river they had crossed earlier. Her words, though foreign, carried meaning that bypassed language. It was a story of travelers who came when the valley called, of shadows that dwelled in the mountains, of a journey that reached back 1,000 years. The flames flared as if fed by invisible wind, casting long shadows across the faces gathered there. The villagers closed their eyes, swaying to the rhythm of her words. The two outsiders felt something stir within them, as though the very air was pulling at their thoughts, whispering fragments of memory not their own. Images flickered in their minds, stone temples buried under earth, battles fought under blood-red skies, rivers flowing with more than water. When the elder stopped, silence fell so deep it pressed against their ears. She looked directly at them and spoke, her words suddenly sharp, deliberate, and startlingly clear. "You have walked into the valley of the forgotten path. You will not leave until the valley has taken what it is owed." The fire cracked. Someone gasped. Children stirred in their sleep. But the elder said nothing more, turning back to the flames as though she had finished what needed to be said. That night, sleep did not come easily. They were given a small hut on the edge of the village. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs, and the walls were lined with furs. The moment they lay down, the distant sound of drums began to echo through the valley, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. The sound didn't stop. Hours passed, and still it carried on, sometimes close, sometimes faint, always pulsing through the night. At some point, exhaustion overcame them, but rest brought no peace. Dreams invaded their minds, dreams of walking down endless stone corridors lit only by torches, of hearing whispers in languages older than the earth itself, of hands reaching from the dark, pulling them towards something unseen. They woke drenched in sweat, the taste of fear heavy on their tongues. The next morning, the village stirred early. Smoke rose again from fires, and hunters prepared to leave for the forest. The tall man returned to their hut, motioning for them to follow. He didn't speak, but the urgency in his gestures was unmistakable. Reluctantly, they followed him through the forest trail. The air outside was damp, filled with the smell of pine and moss. Birds circled overhead, their cries sharp and strange. The path twisted downward until they reached a clearing where the ground sloped into a wide pit. At the center of the pit stood a massive stone slab half buried in the earth. its surface carved with spirals and symbols like those they had seen on the cliffside the day before. Round the slab, villagers stood in silence. The elder was already there, her staff planted firmly in the soil. She raised her hand, and the tall man guided them closer. The elder began to speak again, and though her words were still in the strange language, their meaning seeped into the outsider's bones. This was the place of beginnings, the stone marked where the first travelers had come 1,000 years ago. Some had returned from the valley. Many had not. One of them stepped forward, unable to help themselves. They touched the cold stone. The instant their hand met the surface, the world around them blurred. They saw visions, men and women dressed in cloaks like their own, walking through forests that no longer existed, building fires in caves, hiding from shadows that moved without bodies. Screams echoed in their ears, and the smell of smoke and blood filled their nose. They pulled their hand back, stumbling, gasping for air. The elder's eyes locked on them. She nodded slowly, as though this was exactly what she had expected. "The path has chosen," she whispered. The villagers began to chant softly, swaying back and forth, their voices blending into a single low hum. The earth beneath their feet vibrated faintly, not enough to knock them off balance, but enough to remind them that something ancient lived beneath this valley, something that had been waiting. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. A chill swept through the clearing. Birds scattered from the trees with frantic cries. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of something far away, like a horn being blown in the depths of the mountains. The elder's face darkened. She spoke again, her voice urgent now. "The mountain has awakened. The journey begins." The villagers backed away, leaving only the two travelers, the elder and the tall man near the stone slab. The tall man pressed something into their hands, two objects wrapped in cloth. When they unwrapped them, they found crude weapons. A short sword made of iron and a bow strung with sinew, along with a small pouch of arrows. The elder touched the staff to the ground, and the stone slab cracked slightly, a thin line of glowing light running across its surface. She pointed toward the mountains beyond the forest. Her words came like a command, one that weighed heavily in the air. "Go. If you do not face what waits, the valley will consume us all." The tall man gestured toward the trail leading deeper into the wilderness. Fear knotted in their stomachs, but there was no choice. They tightened their grips on the weapons, exchanged one last uncertain glance, and stepped onto the path that would take them away from the village, away from safety, and toward the heart of the ancient valley. As they disappeared into the trees, the elder's voice drifted after them, carried by the wind. "Remember, the valley does not forgive." And with those words still ringing in their ears, they began the long descent into a journey that had started 1,000 years before they were ever born. The trail leading away from the village grew darker and narrower with every step. At first, there was the comfort of bird song and the sound of leaves shifting in the morning breeze. But as they pressed deeper into the forest, those familiar signs of life began to fade. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches tangled together overhead until they blocked out much of the sunlight. Shadows stretched long and heavy across the ground, and the air smelled damp, like earth that had not been disturbed for centuries. They walked carefully, every twig that cracked beneath their boots sounding too loud, like it would awaken something sleeping nearby. The crude weapons gifted to them felt heavier with each mile. Neither of them had ever carried swords or bows before. But the weight was more than physical. It was a reminder that survival here might depend on more than courage. The further they went, the more they noticed strange signs etched into their surroundings. Trees bore claw marks too deep and wide to have been made by wolves or bears. Rocks bore symbols similar to those carved into the stone slab bat at the pit spirals, eyes, and shapes that resembled twisted creatures. The air grew colder, as if every step forward carried them not only through space but into a different age altogether. Hours passed in silence. The forest seemed endless until suddenly it broke open into a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood the ruins of what once might have been a stone outpost. Walls now crumbled into moss-covered heaps, but one tower still rose above the trees, its jagged silhouette leaning precariously, as though one strong wind might send it tumbling. They approached carefully, their footsteps muffled by thick moss. As they drew closer, they saw more signs of human presence: old fire pits filled with ash, broken pottery shards scattered across the ground, and bones bleached white by time. Some bones were animal, but others were unmistakably human. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. One of them whispered, "This place feels wrong." The other nodded slowly. Like something's watching us. They stepped into the ruins, drawn toward the tower. Inside, the air was cooler, damp with the smell of stone and decay. The walls were lined with faded carvings, battle scenes etched into the stone, showing figures with spears fighting against towering, shapeless shadows. The carvings grew darker the higher they went, as if telling a story that only worsened with time. At the base of the tower, they found a staircase spiraling upward. It looked unstable, stones missing in several places. But curiosity and a strange pull urged them to climb. Every step groaned beneath their weight. Dust rained down, and bats fluttered overhead, screeching as they escaped into the daylight. Halfway up, they paused. A low humming filled the air, not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. It was faint at first, almost like the echo of their own heartbeat, but it grew stronger with each step, until it felt as though the entire tower vibrated. Their hands brushed the stone, and they swore they felt it pulse like flesh. At the top of the tower, they found a small chamber. The roof had long since collapsed, allowing a shaft of light to spill inside. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal carved from dark stone, unlike any they had seen before. Resting upon it was an object wrapped in rotting cloth. They exchanged a nervous glance. Curiosity won over fear, and one of them slowly pulled the cloth away. Beneath it lay a dagger, its blade black as obsidian, its hilt wrapped in leather that looked far too well preserved for something left in ruins for centuries. The dagger gave off a faint glow, not bright, but enough to make their skin crawl. The moment the blade was exposed, the humming grew into a low roar. The tower shuddered violently, and cracks split the stone beneath their feet. From the shadows of the chamber's corners came a sound, rasping breaths. Too deep to belong to anything human, figures began to take shape in the darkness, tall and thin, their forms shifting like smoke, yet solid enough to scrape claws against stone. "Run!" one of them shouted, grabbing the dagger instinctively. They bolted down the spiral staircase as the shadows followed, their hissing growing louder. The stairs crumbled behind them, pieces of stone crashing into the depths below. Somehow they reached the ground, bursting out of the tower just as part of its wall collapsed, sending dust and rubble billowing into the clearing. The forest had grown darker, the air was colder now, and the sunlight dimmed unnaturally, as though the sky itself had been veiled. Behind them, the shadows moved in the ruins, not leaving, but watching, waiting. They stumbled forward, clutching the dagger tightly. It pulsed with a strange heat, almost alive in their grip. Every instinct told them it was dangerous, but at the same time, it felt like a key, something that tied them to the valley's secrets. Not far from the ruins, they came across a stream, its water clear and cold. Kneeling to drink, they saw their reflections shimmer oddly, instead of their own faces. For a brief second, they saw others staring back, warriors in ancient armor, faces scarred, eyes hollow. The vision lasted only a moment before the water rippled, returning to normal. But both of them had seen it, and neither spoke. As the day waned, they found shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, it was dry but smelled faintly of smoke, as though others had once used it as refuge. They built a small fire, careful to keep it hidden, and sat in silence as the flames flickered against the stone walls. The dagger lay between them, its surface catching the firelight. It seemed to breathe with them, its glow rising and falling like a heartbeat. One of them finally whispered, "I think this is what the elder meant. The valley doesn't forgive because it remembers. This dagger, it's part of that memory." The other nodded slowly, staring into the flames. "Then maybe it's not just about surviving. Maybe we're here to finish what someone else started 1,000 years ago." Outside, the forest whispered with unseen life. The wind howled through the trees like distant voices. Somewhere far off, the sound of a horn echoed again, the same deep, mournful note they had heard near the stone slab. They didn't sleep much that night. When their eyes did close, the dreams came again, visions of battles, screams, and shadows blotting out the sky. And always at the center of it all was the dagger, glinting black as it dripped with blood not their own. The valley had awakened, and their journey had truly begun. Dawn broke unevenly across the valley, casting long, jagged shadows from the cliffs onto the forest floor. Mist clung to the ground, curling around tree trunks and tangled roots like restless spirits. The two travelers woke in the small cave, their muscles stiff and sore, eyes bloodshot from the restless night. The dagger lay between them, its black surface dim in the morning light, but still pulsing faintly. As if impatient, they emerged from the cave carefully, scanning the forest. The path ahead was uncertain. The tall trees seemed to close in, leaves rustling as though whispering secrets they could almost understand. Somewhere above, the mountains loomed, their peaks shrouded in clouds. The stream from the night before wound through the forest, glinting faintly in the morning light, guiding their direction without giving away what lay beyond. They moved cautiously, following the stream upstream where the water became narrower, faster, and more treacherous. Rock slick with moss jutted from the banks, forcing careful, deliberate steps. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them flinch, and the dagger felt like an anchor in their hand, a talisman, but also a warning. Hours passed, and the forest began to change. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their bark blackened and etched with ancient symbols. Some branches reached down like skeletal fingers, scraping against their cloaks as if trying to hold them back. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the air thickened, carrying with it a metallic tan blood, iron, or something else they couldn't name. They came across a narrow ravine, a natural bridge of stone, slick with dew and moss, stretched across the gap. But the drop below seemed endless. The sound of water crashing somewhere far beneath filled their ears. One of them tested the bridge carefully, foot by foot, while the other followed, gripping the dagger tightly. Midway, the stone shuddered, a low rumble vibrating through the ground. "What now?" whispered one of them. The other swallowed hard. "Keep moving. There's no turning back." They crossed slowly, hearts pounding, the fog thickening around them. Once on the other side, the forest opened into a plateau, where the ruins of an ancient settlement rose like a ghostly city. Crumbling walls and broken towers jutted into the sky, their stones covered in moss and vines. The settlement seemed abandoned, but not completely. Faint smoke trails curled from cracks in the walls, and distant footsteps echoed faintly as though someone or something was still alive within. They approached cautiously, their weapons ready. Each step felt heavier, as if the valley itself weighed down upon them. The wind carried whispers in an ancient language, voices half heard, half imagined, sending shivers down their spines. Occasionally, the dagger pulsed in their hand, warm and insistent, guiding them toward the center of the ruins. In the main square, they found a well, enormous and deep, carved from stone so old it had begun to crumble. Round it were scattered bones, some human, others unrecognizable, and small trinkets, charms, broken tools, jewelry, all bearing marks of age and ritual. The well seemed to draw the eyes, and the dagger pulsed violently now, almost as if it were resonating with something beneath the stones. As they peered into the well, a sudden gust of wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the stench of decay. Something moved below, a shadow so vast it swallowed the light. The sound of claws scraping stone echoed from the depths, followed by a low, guttural growl that shook the ground. They stepped back, adrenaline surging. One whispered, "It's alive. Something down there is alive." Before they could decide what to do, the ground beneath them trembled. A section of the stone floor cracked, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The dagger vibrated in their hand, its pulse synchronizing with the low hum coming from the depths. They exchanged a glance, unspoken agreement passing between them. They had to descend. The staircase was steep and slick with moisture, each step echoing ominously. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became, and the smell intensified. Earth, rot, and something far older, more elemental. The walls were carved with pictographs, figures battling enormous creatures, rivers of fire, and glowing symbols etched into stone that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the dagger. At the bottom, they emerged into a cavern so vast it was impossible to see its end. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the ceiling vanished into darkness. Pools of water reflected the dim glow of luminescent moss, casting eerie patterns across the stone. The dagger pulsed now like a heartbeat, guiding them toward a massive door at the far end, carved from a single piece of black stone. Its surface shimmered faintly, etched with spirals and figures writhing as if alive. As they approached, the temperature dropped suddenly. Their breaths became visible, mist curling in front of their faces. The dagger's glow intensified, illuminating a series of inscriptions at the base of the door. One of them crouched to examine them. Their instructions. Or a warning, they said. The symbols seemed to tell a story. A 1,000-year-old traveler, cursed by the valley, seeking passage into the unknown, fail, and be consumed, succeed, and bear the memory of the valley forever. A sudden tremor shook the cavern. Dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling, and the growling sound returned deeper, closer, louder. Something massive stirred in the darkness, something that had been waiting for centuries. Shadows stretched and moved independently of any light source, writhing like smoke, creeping along the walls, reaching toward them. The other whispered urgently, "The dagger. It's not just a key, it's the only protection we have." They pressed forward, the glowing blade held before them. With every step, the shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing, but never stopping. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the valley itself held its breath. Reaching the black stone door, they could feel the pulse of the dagger syncing with the carvings. A single touch against the cold stone caused it to hum, low and resonant, vibrating through their bones. The door shivered, then slowly began to move, grinding with the sound of centuries-old mechanisms. Beyond the door lay darkness, so complete it seemed alive, pressing against them, whispering in voices they couldn't comprehend. The valley's secrets awaited them on the other side, and every instinct screamed danger. But there was no turning back now. They stepped through together, the dagger held high, the shadows retreating just enough to allow passage. What awaited them was unknown, but one thing was certain: the journey was far from over, and the valley had only just begun to reveal its memory. The darkness beyond the black stone door was suffocating at first. They could barely see a hand in front of their face, and the only source of light was the faint, pulsing glow of the dagger. Its black surface seemed to absorb all surrounding shadows, while simultaneously illuminating the path forward in an eerie, unnatural way. Each step echoed, hollow and sharp, across the stone floor of the hidden corridor they had entered. The air was damp, carrying the smell of ancient stone, mold, and something coppery like blood, long dried yet lingering. Their footsteps disturbed the silence, producing a hollow thud that seemed to bounce back from unseen walls. The corridor stretched endlessly, twisting and turning unpredictably, sometimes narrowing to a crawl space, other times opening into high-ceilinged chambers with walls covered in strange, writhing carvings. At one point, they paused in a larger room, the ceiling lost in shadow. Pools of stagnant water reflected the dagger's glow, rippling when they moved. The carvings along the walls told stories: hunters fighting grotesque creatures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, figures being swallowed by shadows, and travelers climbing mountains that bled mist and smoke. The two travelers couldn't shake the feeling that the carvings were moving, subtly changing when not directly observed, as if the valley itself was alive and watching. A distant sound drew them forward, a faint, melodic chime, barely audible over the dripping water and their own breathing. It was rhythmic, almost like a bell ringing in slow motion. Following the sound, they came to a series of stairs carved into the stone, winding downward into the earth. The dagger pulsed stronger here, guiding them, almost urging them to descend. At the bottom, they found themselves in a massive cavern. The space was enormous, its roof lost in shadows, supported by jagged stalagmites rising from the floor like the teeth of some ancient beast. At the center of the cavern stood a pedestal, larger than the one in the tower above, carved from a single block of obsidian black stone. Upon it rested a book, its cover edged with symbols that seemed to crawl and twist in the dim light. As they approached, the air grew colder, and a low hum filled the cavern. The dagger's glow intensified, casting strange shadows across the walls. The book seemed to pulse in response, a living thing waiting for recognition. One of them reached out cautiously, fingers trembling as they touched the cover. The moment they did, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, and a deep growl reverberated through the cavern. Shadows erupted from the walls and floor, twisting into forms that resembled the figures in the carvings, elongated, hollow-eyed creatures that moved silently yet with predatory intent. The travelers backed away, dagger raised, its pulse now like a heartbeat in their hands. The shadows surged closer, testing the boundaries of their courage. They realized that the dagger was more than a weapon, it was a conduit. It seemed to push the shadows back when held forward, its pulse resonating with the stone around them. But each pulse drained something from them, a warmth that was replaced by fatigue, as if the dagger demanded strength in exchange for protection. Breathing heavily, they moved carefully toward the pedestal again. The book's surface shimmered, showing glimpses of landscapes and faces that didn't belong to their time, images of the valley 1,000 years ago, of travelers who had walked similar paths, and of the shadows that had awaited them since then. The words inside shifted as they watched, written in an ever-changing language that somehow made sense to their minds. One of them began to read aloud, voice echoing unnaturally in the cavern. The text spoke of the valley's memory, of travelers who had come before, of guardians who were neither alive nor dead, and of a path that could either save them or consume them entirely. The more they read, the more the shadows recoiled, writhing as though resisting the light and sound of the knowledge being unveiled. Suddenly, the floor trembled again. A fissure opened near the pedestal, glowing with the same eerie red light they had seen in the roots back in the hidden valley. From it rose a massive form, a shadow larger than any of the smaller creatures, its eyes like burning coals, and limbs that twisted impossibly. It let out a roar that shook the cavern, sending droplets of water raining from the ceiling and vibrating the very stones beneath their feet. They realized that the creature was drawn to the dagger's pulse, moving to claim the power it contained. Holding the dagger tightly, one of them shouted, "We have to fight it, now!" The battle was chaotic. The shadows surged, and the dagger glowed brightly, casting long, flickering beams of light that cut through the darkness. Every strike with the dagger against the massive shadows seemed to push it back, but each push required effort, and exhaustion began to weigh them down. The cavern itself seemed to resist, walls shaking, rocks falling, water splashing, as though the valley was testing their resolve. Finally, after what felt like hours, but might have been only minutes, they managed to drive the massive shadow back toward the fissure. The dagger pulsed one final time, a powerful beat that echoed like a drum, and the shadow was sucked into the glowing crack, disappearing with a howl that reverberated through the stones. The cavern fell silent. Only the drip of water and the faint hum of the dagger remained. Both travelers sank to their knees, breathing heavily, hearts pounding, and eyes wide with disbelief at what they had survived. They looked at the pedestal. The book lay open, its symbols now calm, the glow fading. One whispered, "We've passed the first trial, but this is only the beginning." Whatever else is in this valley, it's waiting. Outside the cavern, the mist of the valley swirled, shadows lengthening, and the wind carried faint whispers, voices of those who had walked this path 1,000 years ago, warning, guiding, or perhaps simply observing. With heavy steps and weary hearts, they moved onward, deeper into the valley, toward challenges that promised to test not only their courage, but their very understanding of time, memory, and the ancient power that lay hidden beneath the mountains. The next morning, the valley greeted them with an uneasy calm. A thick fog clung to the ground, curling around their boots and rising to meet the low branches overhead. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost expectant, as if it were holding its breath after the chaos of the cavern. Their muscles ached from the previous night's struggle, and every movement reminded them of the weight of the dagger still pulsing faintly in their hands. They followed the path that wound upward along the base of a mountain, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous with each step. Loose stones skittered underfoot, and roots twisted like serpents, threatening to trip them at every turn. The trees here were older, taller, their bark scarred with deep grooves and strange carvings that seemed almost alive, shifting subtly when looked at from the corner of the eye. The valley around them whispered constantly. Sometimes it was a wind through the trees, sometimes it was voices, faint and indistinct, repeating phrases in a language they almost understood. Occasionally, shadows moved across their path, long and fluid, vanishing when they turned to look directly. The valley itself seemed aware of their presence, testing, guiding, and sometimes warning. Hours into their climb, they reached a plateau where an enormous stone door was embedded in the mountainside. The door was etched with symbols they recognized from the cavern and the ruined spirals, eyes, figures entwined with serpentine forms. The dagger pulsed violently as they approached, resonating with the carvings in a way that made the ground beneath their feet tremble slightly. One of them knelt to examine the symbols. "This is a warning," they said, "or maybe a riddle. It talks about guardians, about trials, about the price of passage." Their voice was barely above a whisper, but the sound seemed to carry across the empty plateau. They realized that entering the doorway would lead them into another trial, deeper into the heart of the valley's memory. They steeled themselves, gripping the dagger tightly, and pushed the heavy stone door open. It moved with a groan, as if protesting after centuries of disuse, revealing a passageway that descended into darkness. The air inside was colder, heavier, carrying the scent of wet stone and decay. The walls were lined with bas-reliefs depicting travelers who had come here before, fighting shadowy forms, crossing rivers of fire, and confronting colossal beasts. Every step they took echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off unseen walls and amplifying the sense of isolation. As they descended, the passage widened into a series of chambers, each more elaborate than the last. One room was filled with water, ankle-deep, reflecting the flickering glow of the dagger. Strange symbols shimmered on the surface of the water, moving as if alive, forming patterns that defied comprehension. They could hear whispers, clearer now, repeating warnings. Beware the shadow that walks in silence. Beware the memory that feeds. In the next chamber, the floor was covered with bones, human and otherwise. Some were broken, others ranged in patterns that suggested ritual or warning. A faint red glow emanated from a crack in the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift independently of the firelight. Every instinct screamed danger, yet the dagger drew them forward, pulsing as though guiding them toward their fate. They reached a chamber dominated by a massive stone statue. It depicted a figure with multiple arms, each holding weapons and tools, eyes hollow but seeming to follow their every movement. Around the statue were inscriptions that seemed to narrate the story of the valley. Travelers seeking power, shadows claiming those who failed, and the eternal cycle of trial and memory. Suddenly, the dagger pulsed violently, and the shadows in the chamber shifted. Figures formed from darkness, taller and more defined than before, moving toward them silently. One leapt from the wall, claws extended, eyes burning with an ancient hunger. The travelers barely had time to react, swinging the dagger in defense. The blade struck true, and the shadow dissipated into a misty wail that echoed through the chamber. They pressed forward, knowing that each chamber held new dangers. The next room was a labyrinth of stone, walls twisting and folding in ways that made it impossible to rely on memory or instinct. The dagger glowed brighter here, illuminating the correct path through the maze. Occasionally, they would hear distant roars or the scraping of claws against stone, reminders that the valley was alive, and its guardians were relentless. At the center of the labyrinth, they found a pit filled with molten rock. A narrow stone bridge arched across it, slick with heat and glowing veins of magma beneath. As they crossed, the dagger's pulse quickened, warning of danger. Shadows moved beneath the bridge, reaching upward with spindly, burning fingers. Every step was a fight against instinct to flee. When they reached the other side, they collapsed, breathing heavily, muscles screaming from exertion and fear. Before them stood another stone door, smaller, yet inscribed with symbols more intricate than any they had seen. The dagger vibrated in their hand, resonating with the carvings. One of them placed it against the door, and the carvings shimmered, revealing a hidden inscription. The valley's memory remembers the brave and the cursed alike. Enter with courage, for beyond this door lies the truth of the 1,000-year journey. With a shared glance, they pushed the door open, stepping into a chamber illuminated by a light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air was thick, almost tangible, buzzing with energy. Here, they felt it, the presence of the valley itself, ancient and powerful, aware of their every thought and motion. Shadows formed along the edges, smaller than before, yet numerous, watching, testing, and waiting. The dagger pulsed stronger, as if calling on their strength, guiding them forward. They knew that whatever lay ahead would demand everything they had: courage, wits, and the bond between them. They advanced into the chamber, aware that the valley's memory was not passive. It would challenge them, manipulate them, and perhaps even try to break them. But the dagger's pulse was steady now, a rhythm they could follow, a lifeline through the darkness. And as they moved deeper, the whispers grew louder, forming coherent words, repeating the same warning they had heard from the elder. The valley does not forgive. The valley remembers. Each word reverberated through the chamber, echoing in their bones, as the true trial of the 1,000-year journey began in earnest. The chamber beyond the last stone door was unlike anything they had imagined. The air was thick with a strange energy that seemed to vibrate against their skin. Light emanated from crystalline formations embedded in the walls, glowing in colors that shifted from deep violet to fiery orange. casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive. The dagger pulsed in their hand, its rhythm in sync with the hum that filled the chamber. A low vibration that resonated in their bones. The floor was uneven, composed of jagged stone interspersed with cracks that glowed faintly, as if molten energy flowed beneath the surface. As they stepped forward, the ground trembled slightly, sending shivers up their legs. The dagger's glow intensified, illuminating carvings on the walls depicting 1,000-year history. Travelers like them moving through trials, creatures of shadow and flame, and beings who seemed part human, part something else entirely. At the center of the chamber, they noticed a pool of water, perfectly still, reflecting the crystalline light above. The surface was smooth, yet it seemed to ripple with an unseen force. One of them approached cautiously, drawn by the way the dagger's pulse quickened near the pool. As they peered into the reflection, they saw not just themselves, but visions of the past figures dressed in ancient robes, carrying weapons and artifacts, stepping into the valley centuries ago. Some walked confidently, others hesitated, and some were pulled into darkness, never to be seen again. The moment their fingers brushed the water, the reflections shifted violently. A figure emerged from the depths, a traveler from the past, frozen in time, eyes wide with fear, reaching toward them as though warning them. The water trembled, sending ripples that distorted the entire chamber. Shadows leapt from the edges, hissing and writhing, merging with the reflections, creating a surreal, almost terrifying panorama of the valley's memory. The two travelers instinctively raised the dagger, its glow cutting through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, yet the reflections continued to move, showing glimpses of the valley's secrets, hidden caves filled with ancient artifacts, ruins consumed by creeping darkness, and paths that led both to salvation and destruction. Each image conveyed both warning and instruction, as though the valley itself were teaching them, shaping them for what lay ahead. Suddenly, the ground beneath the pool cracked with a thunderous sound. Water splashed upward violently, and from the center rose a massive creature, its body formed of both water and shadow, eyes glowing with a deep, malevolent intelligence. It spoke not in words, but in thoughts, directly into their minds. You trespass in the memory of the valley. Face what you have awakened, or be consumed. Fear surged through them, yet the dagger pulsed with renewed strength. They realized the blade was not just a weapon, but a conduit, channeling the energy of the valley into a form that could resist the darkness. With trembling hands, one of them swung the dagger at the creature. The blade cut through the shadowy water, sending sparks of energy cascading in all directions. The creature recoiled, shrieking, its form distorting and rippling across the pool. They worked together, coordinating their movements, using the dagger to strike repeatedly. Each hit pushed the creature back, yet each strike also drained their strength. As if the valley demanded a toll for every victory. Sweat poured down their faces, their hearts pounded, and fear threatened to paralyze them. But they pressed on, drawing courage from one another. After what felt like an eternity, the creature screamed and dissolved into the pool, leaving only rippling water and a faint glow. Silence descended, heavy and thick. The reflections on the water calmed, revealing only the crystal-lit chamber and the two travelers. Exhausted, but alive, the dagger's glow dimmed slightly, settling into a steady, reassuring pulse. As they caught their breath, the walls began to shift subtly. Crystals rotated and rearranged themselves, forming a narrow corridor leading further into the mountain. It was clear that the chamber had been both a test and a guide, designed to prepare those who ventured into the valley for what awaited deeper within. They continued down the corridor cautiously. Every step echoed, the shadows in the corners of their vision flickering and stretching. Strange symbols carved into the walls shifted as they moved past, and the hum of energy beneath the stone floor seemed to synchronize with their heartbeat. The valley was alive, aware of their presence, and actively shaping their path. Eventually, they reached a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow. A river of molten rock cut across the chamber, casting a red-orange glow that illuminated towering statues of forgotten travelers, their faces frozen in expressions of awe and terror. Bridges of stone arched across the river, with the heat radiating from the molten flow made each step a careful negotiation between courage and survival. The dagger pulsed urgently now, warning of movement in the shadows that lurked along the edges of the cavern. Creatures began to emerge, their forms grotesque, a blend of shadow, stone, and fire. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their mouths opened in silent roars. The valley had awakened yet another guardian, and the travelers had no choice but to confront it. With a shared nod, they advanced. The dagger cut through the air, its glow illuminating the immediate space, repelling the shadows just enough to allow passage. The creatures lunged, but each strike of the dagger sent shockwaves that fractured the stone floor slightly, demonstrating the valley's raw power and its unwillingness to be tamed. Step by step, they moved forward, each encounter with the shadows teaching them more about the valley and the way the dagger connected to its memory. They began to anticipate the movements of the creatures, to feel the rhythm of the valley's pulse, and to understand that survival required more than courage. It required attunement to the ancient energy that flowed through every stone and crystal in this place. By the time they reached the other side of the cavern, the first light of dawn outside the mountain hinted through cracks above, casting golden rays that mingled with the red-orange glow of molten rock. Exhausted, battered, but alive, they paused to survey what lay ahead, a narrow path climbing steeply into darkness, leading further into the heart of the valley. The valley had tested them, yet it was clear that this was only one of many trails. The journey stretched before them, endless in its uncertainty and danger, and the dagger, pulsing steadily, reminded them that the memory of the valley would continue to challenge, shape, and demand from them everything they had. And so, with hearts heavy but determined, they began the next leg of their 1,000-year journey, stepping into the unknown, aware that the valley did not forgive, yet willing to face whatever it demanded. The path ahead twisted sharply, carved into the mountainside, narrow and precarious, with sheer drops on either side. Mist clung to the cliffs, drifting like spectral fingers that sought to grab at their cloaks and slow their progress. Each step was deliberate, every foothold tested before weight was placed upon it. The dagger's pulse had become a constant companion, a rhythm they relied on to navigate the treacherous terrain. Its glow illuminated the jagged rock walls, casting moving shadows that seemed to warn of unseen dangers. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became. Breathing was labored, each inhalation sharp and cold. The wind whistled past them, carrying distant echoes, possibly the cries of creatures or the valley itself communicating in a language beyond comprehension. Occasionally, a loose stone would tumble into the abyss below, vanishing into darkness accompanied by a faint, echoing wail that sounded impossibly alive. At one ledge, they found carvings etched deep into the rock face. Ancient figures, warriors wielding strange weapons, faces frozen in terror and determination alike. There were inscriptions alongside them, shifting slightly when observed from different angles. They seemed to tell of travelers who had dared this path centuries ago, some lost, others transformed, yet all marked forever by the valley. The realization sent a shiver down their spines. The valley's memory did not only remember events, it remembered people, marking their essence in stone, in shadow, in energy. A sudden sound made them freeze. From above, a cluster of rocks loosened, clattering down the mountainside. Before they could react, a shape lunged from the mist, a creature both familiar and horrifying. Its limbs elongated, movements fluid yet unnatural. Its eyes glowed dimly, reflecting the dagger's light. The valley's guardians had found them again. Instinct took over. They raised the dagger, its pulse quickening. The creature hissed and struck, but the dagger emitted a sharp surge of energy. Throwing it backward, they moved as one, following the rhythm of the pulse, striking and dodging, until the creature vanished into the mist with a final scream that echoed along the mountainside. Heart-pounding, they pressed on. The path narrowed further, forcing them to proceed single file. The cliff wall on one side jutted dangerously close, rough and cutting. On the other, the drop into nothingness seemed to stretch endlessly. Every step demanded full attention. A single misstep could be fatal. Hours passed. The sun had moved across the sky, shadows shifting dramatically. They found temporary refuge in a shallow cave, its interior just large enough to shield them from the wind. Exhausted, they rested, listening to the distant hum of the valley, a persistent sound, like a heartbeat spread throughout the mountains. The dagger lay between them, glowing faintly, almost comforting amidst the relentless pressure of the journey. As they resumed their climb, the terrain changed. The forest gave way to jagged rocks and cliffs, the colors muted and cold. The wind grew harsher, carrying particles of frost that bit at exposed skin. From the mist emerged glimpses of ruins, pillars and walls, remnants of a civilization long forgotten. The structures were entwined with roots and vines, nature reclaiming what had once been a place of life and activity. At the largest ruin, a massive stone gate loomed, partially collapsed. Symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with the dagger. They approached cautiously, touching the gate. The dagger vibrated violently, and a low rumble shook the ground. The gate slowly opened, revealing a courtyard filled with shadows moving independently of light or source. The air was thick with tension. Every movement felt watched, every breath recorded. Inside the courtyard, a series of trials awaited. One path led to a bridge over a chasm filled with swirling mist and flickering shadows. Another through a narrow corridor lined with statues whose eyes seemed to follow their every move. Each step required careful observation, courage, and reliance on the dagger's guidance. Missteps produced immediate consequences. Statues shifted, creating barriers. Shadows lunged, and parts of the ground gave way to unknown depths below. At the center of the courtyard, they discovered a circular platform, carved with concentric rings of symbols that pulsed with energy. The dagger's pulse aligned perfectly with the carvings, suggesting a mechanism or ritual to activate. Standing there, they could sense the valley itself watching, the platform seemingly alive, awaiting interaction. With hesitation, they placed the dagger in a carved indentation at the center. Immediately, the platform glowed, symbols lighting up in sequence, casting long shadows that danced across the surrounding ruins. A low hum resonated through the air, growing in volume, vibrating through the stone, their bones, and even their hearts. The shadows surrounding them recoiled slightly, as though acknowledging the power of the dagger and its connection to the valley. Suddenly, the ground beneath the platform shifted, revealing a stairway descending into darkness. A cold wind rushed upward, carrying whispers and warnings. The valley does not forgive. The valley remembers. The valley tests the brave. Despite fear, they knew they had no choice but to descend. With the dagger held firmly, they stepped forward, descending into the unknown depths. The stairway twisted and turned, the air growing colder, denser, and the shadows along the walls more animated. Every step seemed to resonate with a story untold, a memory alive, marking the valley as a place where time itself was fluid, and the past constantly bled into the present. At the bottom, the stairway opened into a massive subterranean chamber. Crystalline formations glowed with an ethereal light, illuminating pools of water, ruins of temples, and figures frozen in stone, as if the valley had captured moments from 1,000 years ago. The dagger pulsed more strongly than ever, guiding them through the maze of remnants. From the far end of the chamber, a sound echoed low, resonant, like the call of something ancient and aware. Shadows detached from the walls, forming colossal shapes that moved with precision and intent. The valley's memory had awakened its guardians fully. The travelers braced themselves, knowing that the confrontation they faced here would test everything they had learned, every ounce of strength, courage, and wisdom acquired during the journey. They exchanged a determined glance, tightened their grip on the dagger, and stepped forward, ready to face the valley's deepest secret. The subterranean chamber stretched endlessly before them, a cavern of living stone and glowing crystals. The air was thick, charged with energy that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Pools of water reflected the shifting light, creating illusions of movement where there was none, or perhaps there was. Every ripple, every shadow seemed deliberate, as though the valley itself was observing, learning, and reacting to their presence. The dagger's pulse had become almost a lifeline, each beat syncing with their racing hearts. It glowed brighter when danger approached, dimming slightly when the path was safe, guiding them with a rhythm both reassuring and unnerving. They moved cautiously, aware that a single misstep could awaken something long dormant. At the center of the chamber lay a massive stone altar, carved with the faces of travelers who had attempted this journey centuries ago. Their expressions were frozen, some in terror, others in awe, but all marked by the valley's memory. The dagger pulsed violently as they approached, drawn toward the altar as if it recognized a connection to its purpose. The moment they set foot near the altar, the chamber shivered. Shadows rose from the walls, forming massive, humanoid shapes, their outlines jagged and flickering like firelight on water. They moved silently at first, circling the travelers, observing, testing. Then one stepped forward, towering, its form shifting continuously. limbs bending in impossible ways. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, burning with an ancient intelligence. A voice not spoken, but felt echoed in their minds. You have reached the heart of the valley. To proceed, you must confront what you carry within. The valley remembers all, and it does not forgive weakness. The two travelers exchanged a glance, understanding instinctively that the trial ahead was not only physical, but mental. The dagger pulsed harder, as if acknowledging the challenge. They moved into position, ready to defend themselves, knowing that failure here would mean more than death. It would mean being consumed by the valley's memory, becoming a permanent part of its dark history. The shadow lunged. Its movement was fluid, almost mesmerizing, limbs stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. They swung the dagger, the blade slicing through the form, but meeting resistance as if cutting through dense fog. Sparks of energy erupted with each strike, illuminating the chamber in blinding bursts. The shadow retaliated, striking with a force that sent them reeling backward. They collided with the altar, and the carvings along its edges glowed briefly, depicting scenes of past travelers who had faced similar trials. Some reached the other side, while others were claimed by the shadows, their forms dissolving into the stone around them. Breathing heavily, they pressed forward. The dagger's pulse guided their strikes, each movement precise, deliberate, fueled not only by instinct, but by an understanding of the rhythm of the valley itself. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to push the shadow back, forcing it toward a fissure in the chamber floor that pulsed with a faint red glow. The battle was exhausting. The shadow's form kept shifting, splitting into smaller figures that lunged from different angles. Each strike of the dagger caused tremors through the stone, forcing them to maintain balance while coordinating attacks. They learned to anticipate the movements, to trust the dagger, and to rely on each other in a way that transcended words. After what felt like an eternity, they finally drove the shadow into the glowing fissure. It let out a scream that resonated through the cavern, shaking stalactites loose and sending ripples across the pools of water. Then, abruptly, the noise stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. But the sense of immediate danger had lifted. The valley seemed to exhale, acknowledging their success. The dagger's glow softened, casting a steady light over the altar. The pools of water now reflected their faces clearly, showing exhaustion, determination, and the faintest traces of awe. They realized that this trial was a rite of passage, a test of courage, skill, and resolve. The valley had pushed them to the limits, and they had survived. Ahead, a narrow stairway carved into the four walls spiraled upward. The valley was guiding them toward the next stage, deeper into its secrets. They paused, catching their breath, and exchanged a glance filled with unspoken understanding. They were stronger now, not just in body, but in spirit. The dagger pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat, as if acknowledging their growth. With cautious steps, they began the ascent. The chamber behind them seemed to recede, shadows dissipating, the whispers of the valley now distant, but persistent. Every step upward carried them closer to the unknown, deeper into the memory of the valley that had existed 1,000 years before they had ever been born. And as they climbed, the valley's warning echoed in their minds, a reminder of both danger and purpose. The valley remembers. The valley does not forgive. Only those who endure will know the truth. They emerge onto a ledge overlooking a vast subterranean expanse. Crystalline formations stretched for miles, shimmering in ethereal light. The dagger pulsed strongly, indicating the correct path forward. Yet, the enormity of what lay before them was overwhelming. The journey was far from over, and the valley's memory promised even greater challenges. Trials that would test every facet of their courage, intelligence, and will to survive. With determination, they advanced, stepping into the expanse, the dagger lighting their way, shadows lingering at the edges, reminding them that the valley's trials were never truly over. Oh, the vast subterranean expanse stretched endlessly, illuminated by the ethereal glow of towering crystalline formations. The light shimmered across jagged stone, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed alive, moving independently of the traveler's own movements. The valley's energy thrummed beneath their feet, a low, resonant pulse that synced eerily with the dagger in their hands. Every step they took felt heavy with anticipation, as though the valley itself were aware of their arrival at its deepest heart. The air was thick, carrying scents of damp stone, ancient wood, and a metallic tang that made their nostrils flare. Pools of water reflected the crystalline light, but the reflections were distorted, sometimes showing faces and figures that weren't truly their ghosts of travelers from centuries past. The whispers of the valley grew louder here, more distinct, chanting in a language that was half memorized, half imagined. Remember, endure, or be consumed. Ahead, the path narrowed, forming a natural bridge of stone across a chasm that seemed impossibly deep. Flames of ethereal fire danced along the edges, flickering with shadows that shifted constantly. The dagger pulsed violently, warning them of danger, yet urging them forward. They advanced cautiously, balancing on the slick stone, hearts pounding with both fear and anticipation. As they reached the center of the bridge, the shadows coalesced. Figures emerged from the chasm below, massive, twisting shapes with eyes like molten gold, limbs that stretched and bent impossibly. The valley's final guardians had awakened. Their presence was overwhelming, a force of both memory and raw elemental power. One whispered, This is it. The heart of the valley. The other nodded, tightening their grip on the dagger. We've come too far to turn back now. The creatures lunged. The dagger flared, emitting a blinding pulse of energy that repelled the first wave of shadows. Every strike required precision, timing, and trust, not only in the dagger, but in each other. The air vibrated with the clash of energy and shadow, the sound echoing through the cavern like thunder rolling across mountains. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted violently. A fissure split the bridge, forcing them to leap to safety. Sparks flew as the dagger cut through the shadows that surged from the abyss, each strike sending shockwaves across the stone. The valley seemed to fight them with every step, testing their resolve and their endurance. At the far end of the bridge, they found a massive stone door, ancient beyond measure, carved with spirals, eyes, and figures in eternal struggle. The dagger pulsed with an almost unbearable intensity, recognizing the doorway as the culmination of the valley's memory. Symbols along the door shimmered and shifted as they approached, revealing a story. Travelers seeking the valley's ultimate truth, many lost, some transformed, and a promise that those who endured would carry the valley's memory forward. The Shadow Guardians surged again, more numerous and aggressive. One of the travelers raised the dagger high, releasing a pulse so intense that it created a barrier of light, pushing the shadows back. The other used the moment to strike the carvings on the door, activating mechanisms hidden for centuries. The stone vibrated, humming with energy, and the shadows hissed in frustration, retreating, but not vanishing entirely. Finally, the door began to open, revealing a chamber bathed in a surreal, radiant light. The ceiling stretched infinitely, filled with floating crystalline structures that shimmered like stars. At the center, a pool of water reflected the entire chamber. Yet within its depths, they saw not only their own faces, but countless other travelers, guardians, shadows all intertwined in the valley's eternal memory. They stepped forward, the dagger held before them, its pulse sensed with the hum of the chamber, guiding their movements. As they approached the pool, a voice not spoken, but deeply felt echoed in their minds. You have endured. You have survived. You carry the memory of the valley. But remember, all who enter leave a mark, and all who leave carry the valley within them forever. With trembling hands, they placed the dagger upon the pool's surface. The water glowed, ripples spreading outward, merging with the crystalline light above. Shadows dissolved, energy coalesced, and the valley seemed to exhale, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the chamber to its core. In that moment, the travelers understood. The valley was not merely a place, it was a living memory, a repository of courage, fear, and experience. To survive was not simply to escape, it was to integrate, to carry forward the lessons and truths embedded in its depths. They felt a connection to the countless souls who had traversed this path before them, a sense of continuity stretching back 1,000 years. The light began to fade gradually, and the chamber's pulse slowed. The dagger dimmed, resting calmly in their hands. Shadows receded completely, leaving only the soft glow of the crystals. Outside, the valley seemed peaceful, yet alive, humming with potential and memory, aware that the next travelers would one day arrive to continue the cycle. The two of them stepped away from the pool, exhausted but transformed. Every scar, every fear, every victory had led them to this point. They understood the valley's power, its memory, and its demands. They had endured the trials, faced the shadows, and emerged carrying the truth of the 1,000-year journey. As they ascended the final passage leading back toward the surface, the valley whispered in subtle tones, almost like a lullaby, "Remember, endure, and carry the memory." The valley does not forgive, yet it rewards those who persist. Finally, they emerged into the open air. Sunlight streamed down upon them, warm and real, contrasting with the cold, ethereal glow of the subterranean chambers. The dagger pulsed gently, a reminder of the journey behind and the responsibility that came with it. They looked at each other, exhaustion giving way to quiet awe. The valley had tested them to the limits of body, mind, and spirit, and they had survived. For a moment, they stood in silence, breathing deeply, the wind carrying distant whispers of the valley's eternal memory. The 1,000-year journey was complete, yet its impact would linger forever, etched into their very being. The valley had not forgiven, but it had remembered, and they now carried its truth into the world above.